So our reading today comes from the Gospel of John, chapter 2. We're going verses 13 through 22. If you're reading along, we are on page 93 in the Pewback Bibles. The Passover of the Jews was at hand, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. In the temple, he found those who were selling oxen and sheep and pigeons, and the money changers sitting there. And making a whip of cords, he drove them all out of the temple, with the sheep and the oxen. And he poured out the coins of the money changers and overturned their tables. And he told those who sold pigeons, "Take these things away. Do not make my Father's house a house of trade." His disciples remembered that it was written, "Zeal for your house will consume me." So the Jews said to him, "What sign do you show us for doing these things?" Jesus answered them, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." The Jews then said, "It has taken 46 years to build this temple, and will you raise it up in 3 days?" But he was speaking about the temple of his body. When therefore he was raised from the dead, his disciples remembered that he had said this, and they believed the scripture and the word that Jesus had spoken. The gospel of the Lord. Good morning, everyone. We made it to March. Anybody else feel like January and February flew? Because I'm still not convinced we're in March already. This year, March 19th is the first day of spring. And I feel like often we connect like March and spring with spring cleaning, fresh starts. And this year we get to add Lent and Easter into it. So it's even more about the new hopes, new ideas, the idea of rebirth in a resurrected Christ. But before we get to that glorious moment of new in a resurrected Jesus, we have to do some cleanup. And as this passage tells us, so did Jesus. Before the destruction of the temple, all Jewish religious life happened in the temple. It's where records were kept. It's where holy people spent their time. It's where lay people came to talk to God through trained men, where they brought their sacrifices to honor God. During Passover, when this passage takes place, there was even more traffic through the temple. People traveled long distances, and traveling with a sacrifice wasn't easy. So sacrifices were available for purchase at the temple and at inflated rates to these travelers. Additionally, to purchase these sacrifices or to leave money at the temple, you had to take your coin and change it in for the local currency, which was also inflated by the people who were in charge of the money. To these business folks, this is just what they did. To Jesus, this was more than unacceptable. It was a disgrace to this particular place of worship. Honoring God will not involve taking advantage of one's neighbor. Honoring God will not come in the form of benefiting for yourself over the next guy. Honoring God will not be capitalizing on market goods in a holy space. God tells Moses in Exodus in the 10 Commandments, "You shall not steal." So the idea of honesty in business dealings wasn't new or earth-shattering. It had already been told to the Jewish people years before. It's part of the ask of God from us in this building of his kingdom. The law of the Lord is perfect. Psalm 19, verse 7. So Jesus lost his cool for a minute, flipping tables, driving them all out of this sacred space, which I feel is a perfectly human response to injustice, a perfectly human response to the disregard of our fellow humans, a perfectly human response to feeling out of control. But I have to wonder, with Jesus' proclamation of his death and resurrection in this passage, if part of this anger was because he knew what was coming and he was trying to prepare spaces for people who would need them. He knew that space like the temple would be where people might gather in likeness to understand his claim of being God's son, of the miracle of the resurrection, a place to preserve safety in that togetherness. And because of that need, he needed to prepare it for these people. like kind of an early spring cleaning, where he was making things a little more settled, a little cleaner, paving the way for fresh starts all across Jerusalem. When I think about what spring cleaning used to mean to me, it was washing curtains and baseboards, cleaning out the kids' clothes to prepare them for the next child that was growing at a rate that they needed all the hand-me-downs. It was getting the yard ready to spend summertime in it, changing out candle smells and mantle decor. It used to be about freshening up the physical things in the house to prepare for the next warmer, sunnier season of life. But the past few years, spring cleaning has changed for me. It's become less about my physical home and more about the metaphysical and the spiritual. Don't get me wrong, Lisa and I were just talking about this. There are still house projects that have to happen, but they aren't the most important parts of spring cleaning. Lent, by definition, is a time of solemn reflection of the last 40 days of Jesus' life. But I wonder if it should be. The season of Lent for me isn't solemn. It's typically reflective, but in a forward-moving kind of way. Lent is a spring cleaning of sorts of the inventory I keep. The people, places, things, and ideas in my life. I sit with the things I've been holding on to, the things I haven't considered, the people I've encountered, the ones I've avoided. I check in with the excessive physical stuff in our house and with the places I've been, and maybe the ones that I should give up on going to. It's a time to intentionally check in with all the parts of my mind, body, and spirit. But why? When I read the story of, all the stories of Jesus's walk on this earth, he was always checking in with people. He was checking in about the things that were important to them. He was checking in with the things that truly affected them. He was trying to find out how they were cared for. He was trying to find out how they were not cared for. I see his walk in opposition to the status quo more than it was ever in line with it, like tossing tables and removing sellers from the temple. The world wants us to believe that all places and spaces of our physical lives and our spiritual lives need to be full of stuff. Good stuff, bad stuff, doesn't really matter. But to be whole, fullness is what matters. And the things that we physically possess or emotionally hold are the markers of status in this full world. What happens when, possibly during this season of Lent, we start doing an inventory check? What are we going to find? Are we going to find excess? Are we going to find things that would enrage Jesus to flip a few tables in our lives? If we think about the things that we're asked to keep during our cleaning spells, the things that we should be anchoring to, the things that we are asked as believers to follow on this life walk, they're pretty simple and really plainly laid out in Exodus. The 10 Commandments are clear. Have no gods other than me. Do not make idols. Do not take the Lord's name in vain. Honor the Sabbath. Honor your father and mother. Do not murder. Do not commit adultery. Do not steal. Do not bear false witness against your neighbor. Do not covet your neighbor's things. I found a poster with a children's version of the 10 Commandments on it, and I want to share it with you because I think they're fantastic. Put God first. Don't love things more than God. Respect God's name. Rest on the seventh day and keep it holy. Obey your parents. Never hurt anyone. Keep wedding promises. Do not steal. Do not tell lies. Don't wish for other people's stuff. Pretty good, huh? Yeah. I really, really connect with the simplicity of the language. I was like, oh, yeah, I could do that. Okay. And it's a little easier to chew on than some of the old Bible-y language gets, right? Like sometimes we're like, what is this talking about? And I'm so thankful when people kind of modernize it and simplify it down for my pea brain to chew on. Jesus added to that ask for us to love one another. If we keep this list of must haves at the front of our minds while we're cleaning out the rest of our spaces, what does the shape of our walk with Jesus in these particular 40 days of Lent look like? Would our focus shift from what we think should be important to what actually is? What would move forward from the shadows? What would move away from the front? What does intentional movement in this spiritual reordering change? Additionally, what does our modern day temple look like? Is it a place? Is it our physical body, like it was for Jesus? Maybe somewhere in between, maybe a combination of the two? Where do we make space to talk to and listen to God? What's the condition of that space, both physically and spiritually? Jesus was keenly aware of his limited time left on the planet, and he continued to push the boundaries of what was right and true. He didn't back down on the need to see people in the places they did life, and was a support for them when he needed to be, and challenged their choices when he needed to. If Jesus was able to continue this path, knowing that his time here was limited, how are we even remotely trying to walk in that similar light? Are we attempting to make that kind of change in this world? We don't know when our timeline is up. We don't know what that looks like. In what ways are we walking like he did? In what ways aren't we? In this season of Lent, how are we trying to make marked change in showing people what God looks like in practical ways and love-filled movements? Not in things, although sometimes things are what is love-filled in the moment, but in our interactions, in our carving out of space for our neighbors, in our intentional movement for the other. Where are your commandments sitting? Are they in the closet? Or are they on your person? Are we living into them with every interaction that we have? If we think about the children's 10 commandments, they're pretty easy to lean into. And I feel like they might make the spiritual cleaning a little easier to work through. Love God first. That sounds easy. I think we overcomplicate it every single day. Those next 9 commandments are a really good starting point for loving God, for intentionally moving in ways that would benefit the world that we do life in. And I'm not talking about the world at large, although I might argue that when we band together in our small world, collectively we better the big world. Loving God means loving and caring for the world and the people in it. But that love also needs to include loving ourselves. Not in boastful ways, but in the ways that allow us to grow into the people that truly profess to believe in a God that loves and challenges us and wants us to do the same. Last time I preached, I challenged everyone to really slow down and sit in the pause. That wildly uncomfortable place where you have to really check in both with yourself and with God. That space that prioritizes your connection with the Holy Spirit, that asks you to listen to what he's saying when you have asks, when you give him thanks, when you tell him your hopes and your dreams. The want and need to build the kingdom is incredibly important, super important. But if you're not checking in with where you're personally sitting with God, you cannot effectively build the kingdom. It's like that old adage of not being able to pour from an empty cup. Same thing. If we haven't checked in on our spiritual inventory, we're not in communication with God. If we're not cleaning out the dirty and the dusty places in our lives to make sure we have space for God, we can't be the best community for his love. And that's what he needs from us. That's what Jesus poured into this world, even when he knew he had limited time left on this planet. So Lent is a great practice time for this kind of intentional cleaning of spaces, but it can't only be during this time of renewal that we strive to check in with God. that we set time aside to check in with our spaces, physical and spiritual. It's a good time to set the practice, right? What is it? 21 days makes a habit. You got double that. It's a good starting point. We have to shift our focus not just to our connection with one another, but to our connection with God. So let's keep checking in with one another, keeping us on track to see how our dusting is doing, how our reorganizing is doing, and how intentional quiet sitting is going. Let's be emboldened to flip one another's tables when maybe things aren't following the path that Jesus walked. Let's be open to being the flipper. Let's be open to having ours flipped. It's a hard one. Let's change this dynamic of Lent from a solemn place of sorrow to an action-filled place of intentional movement toward God as a big, huge thank you for giving us his Son, who saved us from sin and who loves us so very much.